Today, joining us on Post Wrestling, he is a multi-time pro wrestling author. His newest book is out this Monday for everybody in the UK and soon to be worldwide. It is Stephen Bell who joins us as we're chatting about Big Daddy versus Giant Haystacks, a super heavyweight story. Stephen, welcome back to the show, and you have been able to pull off the task of you have written wrestling books and you've come back for more, and that is an arduous task, and you've tackled quite the story here with Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks. So congratulations, first and foremost.
Thank you. Yeah, it took me a couple of years to sort of get back into the wrestling writing world. I sort of eased back into it with a real long historical article that Inside the Ropes magazine asked me to write, and that actually involved some of the themes, and it really sort of gave me the bug for it again. I thought, yeah, I'm ready to dive back in. And then you realise that you've starting to get a bit prolific when you're on your third appearance on Post Wrestling.
Yes, I mean it's once you hit 5, you get the commemorative jacket. So we will see how many more books you have in you. But when we last had you on, we were discussing the Dynamite and Davey book. Did one bleed into the other, or when you completed that book, was there a bit of a gap before you were inspired enough to what am I going to dedicate my time toward?
It was the inspiration a little bit. They're a little bit of both, really. In terms of the research, one has heavily bled into the other. Both Dynamite and Davey tagged with and against both of these guys at certain points, which meant that the names came up a lot in my research, particularly of that sort of late 70s, early 80s period. And I found out some fascinating stuff that I just genuinely didn't know, especially about Giant Haystacks' time in North America in Stampede Wrestling, where him and Dynamite were North American tag champs together. And even more so about Shirley Crabtree, who would become Big Daddy. I sort of went down a bit of a research mine with him, really, and found out all the fascinating stuff of his life and his career before Big Daddy, which is so fascinating. I think that it really does force you to open the curtain a little bit behind the scenes of wrestling, because the reason why that period of his life and career is so unknown is because it kind of got buried purposely, so that the Big Daddy character could be elevated. They wanted to present this Big Daddy character as a real working man, as though somebody that they've just almost got off the street to come and tackle these huge veteran eels who were career-trained professional wrestlers, and they wanted to present him as something new and fresh. In reality, that was nothing of the case. There was nobody more institutionalized in the wrestling world than Shirley Crabtree. But they did such a good job of almost covering that up, sweeping it under the carpet, that it did genuinely get forgotten about. And so researching that, and I feel like it really does need bearing in mind. I read even sort of Dave Meltzer's obituary. He's known for his obituaries, and I read his after Shirley Crabtree died, and even he had no mention of the Shirley Crabtree's career before Big Daddy, the sort of 20 years where he'd been a British and European heavyweight champion. I saw a national newspaper that did an obituary on him stated openly that his career started in 1975, and it definitely didn't. I found that interesting microcosm into how, in them days, what wrestling promoters and wrestlers themselves wanted to become reality, they could almost manifest into being reality.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious when you bring up Dave Meltzer. I think so much of the discussion about Big Daddy, it comes around the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, and he being one of the lightning rods when it comes to candidacy. And you have those that feel, here is someone that was such a cultural institution that I would imagine, better than anyone, that even present day, still a name that people recognize, versus how much damage did this individual do. And I think at the very least, whatever side of the fence you're on, this was someone that I think this is the kind of research project to really dive in deep and let's make the case, pro, con, or many aspects in between.
Yeah, you mentioned the pop culture thing, and it's so amazing. I mean, Big Daddy in particular was a bona fide celebrity, mainstream celebrity, for 5 to 10 years in this country. There was very few people more famous than Big Daddy, and him and Giant Haystacks are still referenced today. And it was so funny. This is an absolute genuine story. I was typing up the sort of final pieces of my, just doing a little bit of final editing really on the manuscript. And one of the most famous soap operas in the UK is called EastEnders, another national institution. And it was on in the background in the living room as I'm typing these words. And I kid you not, one of the characters on there, Alfie Moon, said to a couple of the female members of his family who were having a typical soap opera type argument, "Will you two behave? You're at it like Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks." This is 45 years removed from the sort of zenith of the popularity. And I started laughing to myself, and my wife knew exactly what I was laughing at because she knows obviously what book I'm on with. And it almost proved a point to her as well. This is why you're writing that book then. And so, yeah, you go back to the Hall of Fame, Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. Yeah, it has become sort of an argument within an argument, really. And I think that if Shirley Crabtree's career was being assessed on the whole, the 40-year career, I think that there is no argument against him going in, because you've got the Big Daddy bit, which was pure bums on seats, transcending the business, bringing so much money, so much attention, so much fame to the business, almost carrying nation's professional wrestling industry on his shoulders himself. You've got that, which is taken into account, but against the backdrop of him being a kind of comedy character who couldn't really work is the theory. But if you take into account the first 20 years of his career, or certainly the first 10, he was an excellent worker. He was built like a Greek god. He was ultra athletic, and
the pictures are remarkable, because I think, to your point, like that aspect of the career, like here's like a super in-fit Shirley Crabtree, and I don't think enough people realize even that like Big Daddy was like, this was like the second act of this guy's career. Like he's pulled out of retirement for what I would generally imagine 98% of the audience is most familiar with when they assess his career.
That's it, yeah. And I think if you take that into account, the truly athletic Act 1 of Shirley Crabtree's career and the title wins, I think that you bleed that into anybody who's counteracting with he's just a comedy character, we're out of shape, couldn't really work, his matches were only short, he needed a tag team partner who could do all the heavy lifting for him. I think that takes that away, because he'd done that, been there, seen it, done it. And I think, yeah, any Hall of Fame that's got him on the ballot, he really should be getting a nod.
So you and I are very similar in ages, and when we talked about like Dynamite and Davey, like that's right at the time that you're a fan in professional wrestling. Is this an era like Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks? What are your introduction specifically to Big Daddy, but it extends to Giant Haystacks? And like, did you have a nostalgia for them, or was it learning more so after the fact once you're getting into wrestling?
My nostalgia element came from the purely the pop culture phenomenon, the fact that they are still so well known and so well referenced today. They're a bit like, the Beatles, I suppose, would be a good example. You know of them even if they were long before your time, because of the impact that they made.
Which is remarkable when we're talking about this gap of time. Like we're talking almost 40 years since World of Sport has ended, and that you can still, in the UK, these are names that they would know.
And because World of Sport ended at the same time that this feud ended effectively, it's everybody from that era. It's their last point of reference. There was never anything other than WWF stuff. There was never anything that replaced them as a more modern point of reference. So anybody from that era that was watching this stuff, anytime professional wrestling is mentioned to them, their first image that they've got in their mind is Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks, still to this day. And so whilst I had no personal memories of them, no real nostalgia, as I say, I was always fascinated by what an impact they'd made. And then when it came to me learning more and more about them through research for other projects, I just found it more and more fascinating. The two as individuals outside of the ring, inside of the ring. I learned more and more about British wrestling's rise to being what it was, which was a phenomenon in itself. It was a national institution. We say up to 20 million people watching on a Saturday afternoon on a regular basis. And so as I researched that more and more, I wanted an avenue or a vessel that I could use to tell some of these stories, because I thought, well, there's another generation on from me now where this is further removed again, and it's going to get lost to time if we're not careful. So I really wanted to explore that. So yes, I decided to do a sort of three-stranded story in this. So we've got Shirley Crabtree, Big Stroke Big Daddy, Martin Ruane, Giant Haystacks, and British wrestling of the time. And what I decided to do was have them three individual strands of storytelling sort of moving along in time, interweaving until, and the most beautiful thing about this from a storytelling point of view is that all three of them reached their zenith, reached their peak on the exact same day at the same event there at Wembley Arena. All three had been building up to that for all this time, and then all three kind of fell away quite quickly after that. So it's a beautiful story arc, and one that we're really proud to tell.
So obviously the namesake of the book is on Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks, but I think as pivotal a figure in this whole story, and one that I came away like really intrigued by to discuss, is Max Crabtree, and of course the brother of Shirley Crabtree. And if you want to like assign a role, like here is like the brains behind the brawn, and such a, like, this is the guy that is pulling the strings as Joint Promotions continues its giant footprint and getting onto ITV. By the end of your project here, like, what was your assessment of Max Crabtree, his contributions, and, you know, as we're talking about like Hall of Fames and such, like where does Max Crabtree fall into all of this? Because whenever you have the star act, it's usually it's a two-person formula, and Max being the other side of that equation with Big Daddy.
I think there's two things that ever so slightly go against Max in terms of his legacy, and that is the fact that he is kind of burdened with British wrestling dying on his watch. It's kind of seen as, which kind of goes against him. And there's also the fact that a lot of people who don't know it in true detail think that he was lucky to have Shirley, when in really it's the other way around. Shirley was lucky to have Max. And I think that them two things, I think a lot of people think that he was maybe a lucky promoter, that he had this superstar brother, when in reality it was him that created the superstar brother. But yeah, everybody that I spoke to, everybody that he interviewed, up to and including Bret Hart, was just lavishing praise on Max Crabtree and what he did for the business. What a genius he was, a visionary, ahead of his time. All these terms were being used about him. And as you say, as I started the book, I did quite intend for him to be a little bit more of a minor character than he turned out to be, but that just couldn't be the case. The more research I did, the more people I spoke to, I thought, no, he is pivotal to this. And I purposely included him more and more because I thought he's got a fascinating story in himself. His self-determination to step away from Joint Promotions, which was the main promotion at the time, to step away and be an independent promoter when he thought that was the best thing to do, and forge his own path, create his own style that he really believed in, until he was finally invited back because he proved himself to be the best promoter in the country. And even then, when he made his way back, he was just a regional promoter within the Joint Promotions machine, until he slowly started giving him the bigger venues to promote at. And then eventually they just gave him the keys to the kingdom because he was so clearly head and shoulders above the rest.
Did you see him, like, had he stayed the independent route, like even with Shirley attached to him, do you feel like he could have found success in that laneway, or that it was one helping the other, that here is the promoter with the star, and now you've got the big vehicle that is Joint Promotions?
I think he could have done, but I just think there'd have been too much machinery working against him. Joint Promotions with the ITV national syndicated product, and which had its time-stamped regular time there on World of Sport was so pivotal. It was so important. So many casual fans thought that that was all that wrestling was in the country. It would have been very difficult to overthrow that, as Brian Dixon found out. Brian Dixon, another excellent promoter, spent 15 years in the shadow of Joint Promotions and Max Crabtree, despite being a very popular and very talented promoter himself. But once Max, I think having the experience, the contacts, the popularity, that once he was reintroduced back into the Joint Promotions fold, it was sort of the best promoter combined with that machinery and that TV contract. At that point, it was an unstoppable force that just went on to set all these records. It got bigger and bigger and bigger. The problem was that he never. I think he felt that could last forever. I think he felt that he could go on forever with this Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks formula. But Shirley was aging and aging quickly. There was both slowly getting more and more out of shape. Meanwhile, his younger stars, he wasn't utilizing properly as he might have done. And we saw the likes of Dynamite and Davey, William Regal, Fit Finlay, Rollerball Rocco, all these guys you could name who went on to be stars in their own right, all had to go elsewhere to find that stardom. If Max might have just ended the Big Daddy formula a little bit earlier and give them a chance to main event a little more, given them a little bit more money, a little bit more exposure, it might have stopped them having to move on, and the product and the TV product would have been better for it, and it probably have lasted longer than it did.
And it seemed to be like this terrific marriage that Joint Promotions and Stampede were able to develop over the years. Yeah. And you would see a lot of those talents that went over to Stampede, vice versa. And while you've seen him, write in the past in his own books, it comes through in this book so clearly how much Bret Hart loves British wrestling, and was like obviously a big contributor to your book. And I thought it was really enlightening just to see, how much of a fan he was of the style of the performers that he got to see firsthand come over to Calgary and get over with different crowds.
Yeah, when I asked Bret for an interview, he was kind enough to grant it, and I'd got some questions prepared, but I barely needed to prompt him. Once I prompted him one or two times, he was off talking with so much passion, so much nostalgia about his memories of being over here in particular. He spoke so warmly about Giant Haystacks being over in Stampede when he was actually the one that named him the Loch Ness Monster and gave him that sort of really impactful run. But when he was talking about his time over here, he was waxing lyrical about all the personalities that he met, how unique it was, the differences between British wrestling and what he knew from North America, and how he loved the differences, how it was so much more relaxed. And it got to the point where it was kind of going off topic a little bit, and I didn't want to interrupt him at all. I was enjoying it, but I was thinking, well, when I've got the transcript afterwards, I was tempted to take quite a lot of it out, because I'm thinking, well, that's not 100% related to the story, especially when he starts talking about strongman Alan Dennison and gym breaks, crybaby gym breaks. But I thought, no, because it clearly gets asked about things like Montreal and Bill Goldberg so much that I could tell he was so enthusiastic and so warmed to this idea of talking about it. When he started talking about being given a spot on the last ever show at Bellevue, the iconic venue of Bellevue, and he just happened to be on tour here when it was the last ever show there, and it was a real big deal that was taking over the locker room talk. Was, oh my God, we've got the last ever show at Bellevue coming up. He was describing being given a spot on that card by Max Crabtree as one of the highlights of his career. He said it still makes him emotional to talk about to this very day. And I just thought, well, when I was assessing it all after, I thought, no, I'm going to leave all this in, because if not, all this valuable stuff and valuable memories that Bret has given me could get lost to time. So I'm glad you've said what you said. I'm glad it's welcome in there, because as I say, I was toying with the idea of cutting some of that wasn't quite fully on topic, but to hear him talk about Kendo Nakasaki and what an
Yeah.
amazing character he was, what an amazing performer he was, people deserve to know that and want to know that.
When you mention aspects being lost to time, you're writing this book, you're releasing it in 2026. We mentioned like the distance in time. Did it become tricky at all when you're researching this and finding figures that were around at the time that are either no longer around now? Like, what were some of the difficulties in reporting on a time period that we're 4+ decades removed from?
Yeah, that is difficult. It's become. It has become difficult, and I think that what I learned on my first ever wrestling book, or it wasn't a fully wrestling book, it was the biography of Douglas Clark, who was Britain's first ever British heavyweight champion. But yeah, there was a lot more to his life and career than that. But I was going back to the 30s for his wrestling life then. And what I found is, especially when you're talking about before the 1980s, before the mid 70s, maybe, kayfabe was so strong that nobody talked about it anyway. So any reports that you find are almost always written in kayfabe. Any newspaper articles. I mean, I found an amazing newspaper article that was so key to this, whereby in Halifax, Shirley Crabtree's hometown, it was one of the first ever meetings, Shirley Crabtree versus Giant Haystacks. It was a matter of months before Shirley had developed the Big Daddy character. And I found this national news report about how a little fan had managed to get in the ring to confront Giant Haystacks because he felt that he was being unfair to his local hero, Shirley Crabtree. When he gets in and apparently shouted, "Oi, you, fight fair," to which 6'10", 300-pound Giant Haystack swats him away, gives him a big cut. He's bleeding. He needs to go to hospital, get stitches. The police come. Giant Haystacks is arrested, questioned. He has to maintain kayfabe during his questioning. This news report is written in kayfabe, and it's 50 years ago now, but still, you think in the mid 70s, different areas were evolving at different times. So it is difficult because, as you say, anybody before that, there's not many that remember that period well or are still with us. Your news reports are all written in that manner. So it is very difficult. As time moves on, you talk to more people who I think have got a newfound freedom by the fact that kayfabe's effectively gone. People like Tony St. Clair, who remembers a lot from that era, was brilliant, so detailed. His memory is really sharp. So yeah, I think it's important that we document these things now while we still can. I think the ability to do it is slowly leaving us.
When I really like the way that you kind of framed the contrast between Shirley and Haystacks and sort of their backgrounds, because when you kind of start from like square one, and these could not be more divergent paths towards this legendary rivalry. Like, here you have Shirley that is essentially born into this business. He's with his brothers. It's almost, he can't escape this industry. And for Haystacks, like, he is completely just recruited into this industry. And it's just such an interesting contrast to see these two that ended up defining one another, but completely different backgrounds. And I really like the way you kind of painted that picture of how, Martin basically just stumbles into this industry and becomes this, huge figure in this industry that he had very little knowledge of.
Yeah, they've both got such, as you say, wildly different stories of how they came to be what they came to be, which is odd given the fact that they are so synonymous with each other. But individually, both of the stories are so fascinating. And yeah, Martin Ruane's story, his life was well on track to be rather tragic, one of just complete poverty, abject poverty. In the early 70s there, he's got 3 young boys. He's only in his early 20s himself, just going from, he'd left school with nothing. He was going from cash in hand job just to put food on the table, and often struggling and not even managing to do that. When the next cash in hand job that he took happened to be as a doorman. And he was one night, his fellow doorman happened to be a veteran mid-card journeyman sort of wrestler for Joint Promotions, and he took him along to a show, introduced him to the business. Martin was an unbelievably shy guy. I think that's the next thing to introduce to his unlikeliness to make it to the top of professional wrestling. So shy, introverted guy that his first thought, once he realized, oh wow, it's all a work, that wasn't a good thing for him, because he thought, well, the last thing I am as a performer is all these larger than life characters putting on such a display. He thought there's no way that he could do that, and he did walk away after 2 appearances. He did walk away. Well, that's just not really for me. Too shy, too introverted. Went back to trying to scrape a living by other means, and realized that he was struggling to do so. So he decided to give it another go. Had to take himself around the world to the Middle East to get the exposure and experience that he needed, away from what he felt were judgmental local people who he felt extra shy performing in front of. And he came back as Giant Haystacks, and it all went from there. He ended up being, shook off that introverted nature that he had, and he ended up being in a film and being friends with Paul McCartney. I mean, you don't get much more sort of getting it to the top of the entertainment business than that.
Of course, the peak of this rivalry occurs in June of 1981 at Wembley Arena, and this match is very accessible online, and it's not going to take you a lot of time to watch this. But just watching this match, it is the best comparison I can make of this is to not even a pro wrestling match, but Kimbo Slice fighting Tank Abbott, where this was a fight for Elite XC in 2008, and it is hardly revolutionizing any kind of MMA skill. But my God, that crowd in Miami is losing its mind, and this was that times 10, where the sold out Wembley Arena is just for 2.5 minutes are on their feet, and it is an unbelievable reaction to what is 2.5 minutes where Big Daddy wins by countout, and 16 million people watch this. And I mean, I am sure that by 2026 eyes, you can look at this and be like, what was the big deal? But my God, this crowd it was a big deal to them. And it was just like such a spectacle to watch this 2.5 minutes.
Yeah, well, I think that the spectacle behind it is down to Max Crabtree and the fact that he kept that crowd, he kept the nation waiting for so long for it. He had them, the whole country was asking for this match from 1977. Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks, he had deployed as a tag team, a big giant killer type monster tag team. And slowly over time, and I spoke to Tony St. Clair and 1 or 2 others about this, Kendo Nakasaki says in his book, he calls it the Big Daddy masterpiece, the fact that he deployed Big Daddy as a heel. I asked Tony St. Clair, I said, do you think that Max always intended to turn Big Daddy babyface and to have him have Giant Haystacks as his nemesis? And he said, yeah, absolutely. Max Crabtree was always thinking that far in front. So when he deployed it, they were a tag team for the better part of 2 years. It wasn't something that he sort of pulled the trigger on early, left them there, but slowly you've got Giant Haystacks as this feral, nasty, caveman type monster heel beating people up. And you've got Shirley, who, even though he's a big guy, he was quite a handsome guy, very smiley, had a real connection with the crowd, and he slowly became popular, and they slowly dripped that in, that Haystacks became jealous of the fact that they were only booing him and they were no longer booing Big Daddy, and it all blew up eventually, as it would do. And the crowd and the country assumed that they were going to get this match in pretty short order, and it was billed a couple of times, but sort of pulled at the last minute. It borderline frustrated the crowd too much and the audience too much at times by taking the match away at the last minute. But he left it until 1981. He knew he couldn't leave it any longer. Shirley in particular was getting too old. He had tried all manner of ways to stall by things like having the rivalry with Mighty John Quinn. He kept Haystacks as Mighty John Quinn's partner and sort of bodyguard, if you like, for that rivalry. So he still had Haystacks in the frame. So it ran out of options to stall any longer. The crowd were growing truly impatient, so he pulled the trigger finally. 6 years after deploying them as a tag team, 4 years after the big bust-up and the start of the rivalry, finally gave them the big blow-off match at Wembley Arena. And yeah, the atmosphere is sensational. What I love most about that match is Haystacks' bump over the top ropes to finish the match. For such a huge guy, he knew after all that time, he knew that the match technically was just going to be a bust. He knew he needed his bump over that top rope and through the table before going through tables was even a thing. He knew that needed to justify the rivalry going on so long. That was the big moment, and it's almost like somebody's sped the video up when he starts doing his big somersault over the top rope. It's a thing of beauty. He crashes out, and it's brilliant. And I think that Martin Ruane, Giant Haystacks, was brilliant. That Brett talked to me about that. The way that it was a lot shorter climax, because obviously it was only like a 6-week tour that he had the first time round in Stampede. But Brett talked to me about how they needed to get that same sort of payoff at the end after billing him and having him perform as this unbeatable monster heel. And they did it twice. They got it over superbly with Jim Neidhart doing his football tackles on him. And Brett tells the story that was Haystacks' idea to sort of have him wobble a little bit more. And then on the third one, it would take the big bump and the crowd would erupt. Similarly, for the tag team titles, Haystacks, Loch Ness Monster, and Dynamite have won the North American Tag Team titles off of Bret and Keith Hart. His final match in the territory is them two going against them to challenge them for the rematch to win the titles back. Nobody thinks he can be beat. And they do this where he's slowly hitting him with drop kicks, having him wobble slightly. And then Keith drops behind him, gets on all fours, so that when he hits the final drop kick, he's got nowhere else to stumble to, and he falls down. Again, the crowd erupted. And Brett paints the picture that a lot of that was Martin's idea and Martin's execution. He certainly knew how to take the big final bump for that big final payoff.
When you outline sort of the fall in the late 80s, I mean, there's a series of events that occur that you outline in the book. There is the death of King Kong Kirk. There is, of course, the cancellation of World of Sport, and the WWF really aggressively targeting that market. When you look at that specific transition of going from, joint promotions to like All Star is in the midst there, but ultimately it is WWF that really cements things, I would say, by SummerSlam 92. How was the fan base's reaction from this cultural institution to here is this juggernaut in the WWF that is now coming in? And did you see the audience like just eventually just accept that now WWF is professional wrestling, or was there still like a nostalgia to like this was our cultural institution that was joint promotions that has been wiped out?
I think what happened, John, is a huge generational shift happened whereby the generation that came along at the same time, you've got a very short gap between the end of British pro wrestling as we knew it. It got World of Sport. There'd been some exposés. Its name had been dragged through the gutter. It had once been a media darling. It was something that was so well received, so well publicized. But that changed in the 1980s after the Wembley show. That the perception of it changed. The media turned on it quite aggressively. There were some exposés written by a couple of disgruntled former wrestlers, particularly about Big Daddy, trying to paint the picture of him being overly dominant in the business, almost to the point of greed. And then there were the death of Malcolm King Kong Kirk, which, if people don't know, he died in the ring with Big Daddy after taking the Big Daddy splash, deemed that it was an heart attack waiting to happen anyway. So sort of no direct fault, but it happened there and then, made huge national headlines. And that was the sort of final nail in the coffin. That's what convinced ITV, no, enough's enough. It's now, we've been loyal enough to this sport, and they cancelled it. That was 1988. And then I think by that point, the generation that had enjoyed World of Sport Wrestling through the 60s, 70s, and up to that early 80s were getting older, and a new generation of younger fans were coming on who didn't really recognize that anymore. And it was them that were captivated by the WWF. It was a new, vibrant, different product, so much more attractive to a younger person. And so that's where as I said at the start of this, the older generation still, to them, professional wrestling is still Big Daddy versus Giant Haystacks, whereas that later generation, of which I am one, yourself are obviously from a different country, but me in the UK, I kind of remember that happening. Professional wrestling was Hulk Hogan, Ultimate Warrior, British Bulldog, Undertaker. That is what professional wrestling was. I think that somebody who was 10 years old in 1994, like I was, speaking to somebody who was 70-year-old in 1994, sure, we would not identify professional wrestling as the same thing. We were worlds apart. And I just think that happened in that such a short space of time there in the late 80s. Vince McMahon was a genius with what he did there, because he offered that product out so cheap to overseas markets, because he knew that they would take it. He knew they would put it on the program. He knew it would be attractive to particularly a younger audience. And by that point then, all he had to do was let that manifest for a couple of years, and suddenly he could start with them big tours. And what had he lost? He'd lost nothing. All he'd done was sell some taped shows at a cheap rate, and it opened up these huge markets. But it bulldozed the domestic markets in those countries.
We'll end it here, and this is a bit of a hypothetical, but you did the extensive research, so I think you can have like an educated guess here. Had Shirley Crabtree and Martin Ruane lived to the point that you were tackling this project, and you got to sit down with these two individuals, do you feel they would have over time been more open about their careers? Do you think that they would have embraced something like this, like looking back upon this, or do you feel like that would have been really hard to imagine, these two kind of like being able to separate themselves and speak sort of like outside of their characters about, this legacy that they left behind them?
I think it's really interesting. I think it would have been difficult for both of them, because they both began to embody their in-ring persona so much out of it. Brett talks about what a morose guy Martin Ruane was outside of the ring. He wanted to be Giant Haystacks almost all of the time. Obviously, wouldn't have been like that with inside his own four walls with his family, but he embodied that character, and they almost became one and the same. Shirley Crabtree talks openly about how Big Daddy, he became Big Daddy, and he loved being Big Daddy, and he loved the attention and the love that Big Daddy got. So I think it would have been difficult for them. You see, tragically, at the Mal Kirk incident, he even testified at the inquest. He wouldn't give away the business. There's reporters there. The video's still around today. There's reporters outside of the inquest waiting to interview him. And he still maintains, and he starts telling these what are blatant kayfabe lies about how, it could have just as easily been me. Mal Kirk's beat me as many times as I've beaten him. I mean, there could be nothing further from the truth than that. So it was difficult for them, I believe. I think Shirley, especially having grown up in the business in the 50s. But then the flip side of that is people like Tony St. Clair talk openly about it. So who knows? They probably would have got there in the end. But I do think that they were two guys who embodied their personas, their in-ring personas, so much, so deep it ran within them, that I think that they probably could have maintained it till the very end.
Well, I think you're going to capture a lot of readers that have a nostalgia for this period, but even more so, I think a lot of people that are at least familiar with the Big Daddy name. are going to learn a lot from this book. Like I really enjoyed kind of just diving into, the extensive history that these two had, and sort of the peak of the ITV exposure, and the match at Wembley, which I found to be like, it's really outlined well, just the whole contextualizing this feud and what it meant for people. So I think you're going to find like a wide range of people that are going to be seeking out this book. And from your description here, like, it seems like this is two characters that still have that connection, which I think is pretty remarkable when you're talking about something that has, we're talking about a match from 1981, for instance.
Yeah, I've already had, because despite it only coming out this Monday coming as we speak, I had 200 advance copies printed for a show, a book launch that I did a few weeks ago. So there's been quite a flood of copies out there already, which I've started to get feedback from. And the nostalgia element is big. There were people there buying it for their grannies, and I've already had feedback saying, "Wow, the nostalgia element is strong with them. They really." I even had one elderly lady get in touch with me direct and say it had invoked memories of her as a young child watching this with her grandparents. So there is that element. I'd like to see a younger generation as well learn so much from it. And I think just breaking down that barriers of who these two guys were in reality, something that's never really been told, something that needs to be told. Two really good guys, did an awful lot for the business, did an awful lot for the families. I just think it's, despite having a bit of a tragic ending, I think overall it's a real feel-good story, a real underdog story. These two guys had no right to make it to where they did in the business or in life, but they managed to get there.
The book is Big Daddy versus Giant Haystacks, a super heavyweight story. It's available this Monday in the UK, and you can pre-order it anywhere internationally on Amazon. So we want to wish you, Stephen, all the best in promoting the book, and for coming on to chat about it, because I found this to be a really, really intriguing period, and just personally, like, learning quite a bit from your research and reporting here in this book.
Thanks for having me again, John. It's great to be on with you.